Welcome to Django REST Framework API for ChatGPT tutorial. In this tutorial, we will be creating an API with Python, Django, and Django REST Framework, which is so powerful to create, serialize, and validate data. On the other hand, we will be using ChatGPT API to interact with our API. ChatGPT is AI model which generates human-like responses. We will be creating endpoints to sign up, getting access token, and allowing users to enter some input, especially code, to send to ChatGPT like we do in chatgpt.openai.com. For example, you see that I have sent some inputs to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT what language is this code written. ChatGPT will guess the code and respond to us. We will be creating users endpoint to create some users. We will be using these credentials to fetch the access token of our own API by using token endpoint. Most of the API products has their own API token. We will be sending our code explain endpoint a request using this token with the body input. We will be sending some piece of code to our API, and our API will convey this input to ChatGPT API, and ChatGPT will respond like a human being and guess which language this code is written. As you see that I have written a Rust lang code, and ChatGPT responded with this code is in the Rust lang programming language. And you see that I have created some endpoint URLs, URL patterns, and also I have created a simple model, which is so easy. And also I have created some serializers and also some piece of functions to communicate with ChatGPT API using OpenAI package. And you see that for serialization and token, we do have some serializers. Also, we do have some view classes. We are gonna develop this application step by step, so see you in the next session to initialize the project. In this session, we'll be setting up our project and install necessary packages. I have created an empty folder which is drf_chatgpt and open the folder with VS Code. Now I'm going to create a virtual environment by using VNV module, and I'll be activating the VNV by typing source VNV bin activate. And now we are gonna install the Django by typing pip install Django. The installation is successfully completed, and now we are going to install Django REST Framework by typing pip install Django REST Framework. After installation, we'll be lastly install the OpenAI to communicate with ChatGPT API by using this package. And now I am going to write our packages to requirements.txt file by typing pip freeze, and we install Django REST Framework, and also OpenAI, and other packages are depend on these packages. And now I'm going to start a Django project by typing django-admin and start project command. I'll be typing a folder name to initialize settings and the base URLs under the src folder. Let's open the settings file to define our installed apps. I'll be adding some comments here, like specifying default apps, external apps, and also internal apps that we will be creating for our project. For external apps, I'll be defining a REST framework for now by typing REST_framework here and save it. And let's run our project to see the basic setup is correct or not. I will type in Python manage_py, run server command and open the local host, and the install worked successfully. Let's stop the development server and visit the Django REST Framework website documentation. Let's click the installation. So far we installed a REST framework in our project. We'll be also using token-based authentication in our project. So we need to add a REST framework.auth token to our installed apps in our settings py. I paste it here and save it. And now let's do migration by typing Python manage_py migrate. As you see that auth token and default Django migrations are sent to SQLite, which is our database for now. And now we are going to create a super user. I'm giving admin as the username. I'm creating a short password. Now let's run the application and open the admin panel, navigating to /admin and typing username and password. You see that we have only admin user. We can create a token for this user manually and save it. And successfully the token is created in the REST framework token table. So far we initialized the application and installed the packages. See you in the next session to continue our project. In this session, we'll be learning how to read environment variables from .env files. Let's import OS module and create a new variable named as API key. And we'll be using OS module .getEnv function to read specific environment variable by its key name, which is OpenAI API key. Let's create .env file and put OpenAI API key here, and we'll be reading our API key from here. You can paste your API key here. Let's install python.env package to read .env files, and we installed successfully. Now let's import that from .env import load.env. We'll be using this function to read .env file, which is under the base directory of our project. So let's test this variable reading from the shell by typing Python manage_py shell, and I'm going to import settings from Django conf, and I'm gonna try to access its value by typing settings.api key. We will be accessing this API key in our project, and we can put our environment variables here. So in this case, we'll be putting our API key here. See you in the next session. In this session, we'll be creating our first application in the Django. So I'm going to type Python manage_py start app and give the app name as API. I'll be adding this name to installed apps as API. So this is our internal app, and I'll be also creating a new file named as utils. I'm going to put OpenAI specific functions here. Let's import OpenAI and also Django settings from Django conf, and specify the OpenAI API key by assigning settings.api key value here. And now I am creating a function send code to API, and also using OpenAI chat completion create function by giving model and specifying the messages, the role of the ChatGPT, telling that you are an experienced developer and tell me what language is this code written by passing my code. This function will make a request to ChatGPT API, and ChatGPT will make an estimation what language is this provided code written. So let's close the function, and here we have a response which has choices. Let's see the example response in the OpenAI documentation. We have choices, which is a list. We are accessing the first object, and inside that object we have message and content. I am interested with that value, so it is content. This is the ChatGPT response. So let's test the function in the shell. From api.utils import send code to API. Copy and paste here. Let's write some simple code. System.out.println and write hello world. This is super simple Java code. So I'm going to pass this code to my function, send code to API, and will be waiting for ChatGPT estimate what language is this code written. So it says this is the Java code, and give some extra information about the Java. Let's try another code with our function. I'm gonna write simple println Rust lang code hello world and wait for ChatGPT response. And it says it is in Rust lang, etc., etc. So see you in the next session to continue our project. In this session we'll be creating our first model, which is code explainer, that has two fields. One of them is input, another one is output. The input field will be storing user code. Output field will be storing ChatGPT response. So let's initialize migration by typing Python manage.py make migrations API, and commit the migrate by typing Python manage.py migrate, and our table is created in the SQLite. Now let's create API URLs. We'll be defining URL patterns here. The project URLs, in the project URLs we'll be including API URLs using include function. I'll be adding prefix as API/version1/ and include the API URLs. And I'll be defining API URLs in the urls.py file. Let's remove these, and we don't need include. We can remove this one as well. And we'll be having users, tokens, and also code explain. These three paths we'll be using in our project. When a request comes to this user's path, user view will be handling this request. And let's name it as users. And we'll be also having token view to create authentication tokens. And also we'll be having code explain view to allow users submit some code and list out previous input and outputs. Let's add internals comment here. Let's import these three user view and token view, and also code explain view. We will be defining these three classes in the views module. We are going to import REST Framework Views and define our first view class, which is code explain view. We are gonna inherit views.api view here, and we will be defining serializer class for this view class. The serializer class will be code explain serializer. We are going to define it later. And this API view, code explain view, will be accepting get and post requests. We will be handling get requests later. So first of all, to handle post request, I am defining post function with the parameters self request and format. We will be having serializer object by instantiating serializer class and giving the request data as parameter, and we'll be checking if the serializer is valid or not. If the serializer is valid, we'll be saving the object and we'll be returning response to the client with the serialized data, and the status will be HTTP 201, which is created. Let's import status from REST framework and also import the response from REST framework response. If the serializer is not valid, we'll be returning serializer errors to the client with the status HTTP 400 BAT request. Now let's import code explain serializer class from API.serializers module. We'll be creating a file and name it as serializers. We'll be importing REST Framework Serializers module and create code explain serializer class. This will be Serializers model serializer, and which has meta class, and we'll be defining model attribute here. This is code explain model. We are going to import from API.models import code explain explainer, and we'll be defining fields to serialize the ID field, which is read-only default, input field, and also output field. We can also define some extra keyword arguments, like specifying a field as read-only or write-only. Here we define output field as read-only because we'll be storing output field from the ChatGPT response. So ChatGPT response will be stored in output field. Now let's override create function of the serializer. Here we customize code explainer object creation process. We give validated data as a parameter to code explainer and extract its values by using ***. After creating an object, we send a request to the ChatGPT API. Here we can use self.request_data to access input, which is entered by the user, or we can use validated data, which is a more proper way, and we pass this input to send code to API function to make a request to ChatGPT API. We receive the output, and we give this output to code explainer object and save it and return the object. This is our custom create function. Let's import send code to API from API.utils import send code API function. And now we can test this view and serializer. Let's go to urls.py and define the user view and token view. before that, let's comment out them, and for a short time we'll be defining these classes and leaving them empty. We'll be editing these classes later. We'll define both of them. So let's make a request to code explain path. Let's run the server and go to our browser. Here you see that we have prefix for our API. The available URLs are listed here. Here you can see that we have code explain path. I'm gonna test it in the Thunder client, which is an extension in the VS Code. We will be making a request to code explain path. As you remember, we had code explain view, which is handling post requests right now. Now we are going to use Thunder client and also body section here. I'm gonna enter a wrong key and make a post request. As you see that the input is required, so serialization is working correctly here. Now I'm going to enter a simple code, which is print hello world, and send it to our API. This is the response of the ChatGPT API. We are sending a code to our API, and our API is conveying this code to ChatGPT API, and ChatGPT will generate the response, and we'll be getting this response from the OpenAI API and store to our database. See you in the next session to continue our project. In this session, we'll be allowing users to make GET requests to code explain. We are having this error because we do not return any response, so let's complete this function. We are going to make a query set by typing code explain explainer.objects.all, and we'll be passing this query set to our serializer class, which is code explain serializer, and we'll be passing many true parameter to get the response as a list, and we'll be returning serializer data to the client. Let's import code explainer model here, and that's it. Let's make a request again. As you see that we successfully get the stored data from our API. See you in the next session. In this session, we'll be creating user view to handle when the client makes request to user's endpoint, which is our path. So let's go to views and inherit views API view like we did before in the code explain view. We'll be defining get function to handle get requests, and here we should create a query set. We'll be making query set with user.objects.all, and also we'll be defining serializer class, and we'll be using user serializer. In the get function, we are instantiating serializer class and passing this query set and also many as true. We'll be returning a response to the client with serializer.data and also status as status.http 200 OK. We are going to import user and user serializer. First of all, we'll be importing user model from django.contrib.auth.models import user. We are using a default Django user model, and also we'll be creating user serializer here. by naming it user serializer and extending with serializer.model serializer. We will be defining meta class here. Let's do that by typing class meta and specify the model as user. We'll be importing the user later, and fields will be serializing ID field, email field, and also username field. We will be serializing password field, but I want to make password field as write-only by specifying in the extra keyword arguments write-only true. So in the user serializer, to use user model, we should import again user model from Django contrib auth models. We'll be using our user serializer in the views and importing here. So this is the basic user serializer and the user view for handling GET request. Let's test this view by making GET request to users endpoint. And you see that we do have only one user, which is admin. Let's complete the user view by typing post function to handle post requests. Like we did before, we are creating a serializer object and passing the request data and checking the serializer is valid. If it is valid, we are saving the serializer. By saving serializer, it saves the user object and return the response serializer.data, and status will be 201, which is created. Otherwise, if serializer is not valid, we'll be returning serializer errors with the 400 bad request status. And now let's test our endpoint. As you see that our serializer is working correct, and we need to specify the username and also a password. Super simple, and it's created. The view class worked correctly. So see you in the next session. In this session, we'll be fixing a problem which is not storing password in the database as encrypted. So as you see that when I go to auth user data in the browse data, I'm gonna check the auth user table, and you see that my second user password is not stored as encrypted. So this is a security problem. So we are going to fix this one by overriding user serializer create method. Let's disable autosave mode in the VS Code and start creating create function. Now we are gonna override this function and customize it by our requirements. We are going to pop password from the validated data. We'll be creating a user by passing validated data to user objects create function. Here we use user.setPassword, the setPassword function, making a encrypted password for the user password, and it's kind of hashing and encrypting the password we are going to save the user, and we are gonna create also a token object for this user. So I'm going to write token objects create users user. This will be creating a token object for this user. Let's import the token model from REST Framework .auth token .models. When the user is created, at the same time, a token will be created for this user, and we are returning the user when post request comes to this endpoint. And now we are going to test the post request again. For now, we will be adding also email of this user. It is not mandatory, but I am adding the email and sending request. It's successful. The status is 201 created. Let's check the database for this user. Browse data, auth user table, and you see that our password is encrypted. Now it's working as expected. Now we are going to create token serializer class to make serialization when a user sends request to tokens endpoint. So token serializer will be inheriting serializer class, and we are going to define username field, which will be char field, and also we'll be defining password field, that will be again char field, but for now we will be passing some parameters like style, that will be input type password, and also we'll be passing the trim underscore whitespace as false. And now let's override the validate function. The validate function takes attributes. Parameter will be accessing the field values using attributes.get function. Will be accessing username and password. We will be using these values to authenticate the user. So we are going to use authenticate function and pass these variables to this function. Also, we'll be passing the request. We can access a request object using self.context.get request. The username is username, password is password, which comes from attributes. If user is not authenticated, we can use like this. If not user, the credentials are wrong. So we can give a message like credentials are not provided correctly, and we can raise a validation error which comes from serializers, and passing this message as credentials are not provided correctly to the client. We can also pass the authentication string to validation error code, and now if the user authenticated, we can set this user to attributes user. We can set attribute user, and we can return the attribute to the client when the validation is correct. Now let's import authenticate function from Django. We'll be importing it from django.contrib.auth import authenticate. So now we are going to create token view, and inherit a special view function which is coming from a REST framework auth token views import obtain token obtain auth token. We'll be using this view and inheriting it, and we will be defining our serializer class as token serializer that we defined in the serializers.py file. Let's import this token serializer from API Serializers and save it. And now we are going to test the endpoint. Let's uncomment this endpoint and test it in the Thunder client. We are going to change here as tokens, and we cannot make GET request for this endpoint, which is special endpoint. We can only make POST request through this endpoint. So I'm trying, and now it's created. The request is successful. Let's try with the wrong credentials, and our serialization class is working as expected. In this session, we'll be adding restriction to our endpoint, which is code explain endpoint. We'll be adding token authentication for the code explain view. Let's import REST Framework authentication token authentication and add authentication classes to code explain view. When the client makes a request to this view will ask some credentials, which is a token. We need to add REST Framework permissions is authenticated to default permission classes in the settings by file. And then when the user makes GET request, the server will respond authentication credentials were not provided. So client must have authentication token to be able to make a request. The client will receive the token from tokens endpoint with the credentials, and when the client makes request to code explain endpoint, it should use this token and token prefix, which is token, and make GET or POST request to our Django API. This is basically token-based authentication in our Django project. In this session, we will see that some requests to ChatGPT. As you see that I asked C# code and something weird code, which is my test language .printing, etc., etc. And also I asked again terminal printing hello, and ChatGPT generated some reasonable messages. And also I added some exception handling in the send code to API function. You see that we have API error handling, connection handling, and runtime limit error handling for our function. In this tutorial, we have learned how to develop our own API using Django and Django REST Framework. In this tutorial, we have learned how to create users and tokens and send requests from our own API to ChatGPT API. We have learned how to add some token-based authentication to our own API as well. We have learned how to interact with OpenAI product, which is ChatGPT in our case. We have learned how to handle and extract information from the response messages. Thanks for watching and joining our tutorial.